Hello everybody and welcome to Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today I'm here with another of our Sun and Moon deck analysis videos. As you can see we've got an Eevee here, so we are going to be going over the Evolution-GXs. One of the ways we're running Umbreon is actually pairing it with Espeon-GX as well. We have got another Umbreon deck list as well, but this one is going to be more focusing on pairing it with Espeon and sort of Energy Denial. So we're starting off, of course, with 4 of the new Eevee from Sun and Moon. 60 HP basic, weak to fighting and 2 retreat, pretty simple. We're running this one simply because it has the energy evolution ability. Whenever you attach a basic energy to this Eevee, you may search your deck for a Pokemon of that type that evolves from Eevee, and it essentially evolve Eevee. So if I attach a psychic type to my Eevee on turn 2, I can search my deck for an Espeon and evolve Eevee into it. Now, because this does count as evolution, you can't do it turn 1, but it doesn't matter really that much. It's still a nice way of being able to search out our evolutions quite consistently. And his attack is just 1 colourless flip a coin if heads draw a card, so nothing crazy good, but worth noting that it's not an awful attack. Next up, we are running 3 Umbreon-GX. I will hold this Espeon-GX next to it just while I explain the GX mechanic. Again, by now you're probably all familiar with it, but just for anyone that isn't, the GX mechanic is very similar to the EX mechanic of old. Essentially, these guys give up 2 prizes when they're knocked out. However, the difference between GXs and EXs, as you can see, is that these can be evolution Pokemon. And also they have all GXs have a special attack called a GX attack. And they can only use 1 GX attack a game. So, for example, we couldn't use Umbreon-GX's GX attack and then Espeon-GX's GX attack. We can only use 1 of these GX attacks per game. We're going to be focusing more on this GX attack in this, there's different situations for both GX attacks. A lot of the time this one's going to be better, but there are some situations, maybe when you know your opponent's only running a certain amount of energy, or a very low count of energy, we can go down more of a sort of a disruption route, but sometimes it is going to be better to be using the GX attack from Espeon-GX, so keep that in mind. I'll go over it when we talk about Espeon. But for now, Umbreon-GX is 200 HP stage 1, which is mad. 200 HP is such a huge number for a stage 1. Weak to fighting as well, resistance to psychic and 2 retreat costs, so all pretty standard stuff. 3 attacks, including a GX attack. His first attack for 1 dark is Strafe, and when you use Strafe, you then switch to your bench, switch a Pokemon from your bench to your active. So yeah, we're running Wobbufetts in here to Strafe into, which is a really, really nice effect. I'll go over those more when I'm talking about the Wobbufetts, but we do have things to be able to Strafe into, so we don't have to put something we don't really want up. We then have Shadow Bullet for a Dark and a DCE, which does 90 damage to the active and a 30 snipe, so it's essentially Darkrai's old attack, Night Spear, but for 2 colourless instead of 2 dark. Now this is really good because it means this is DCE compatible, which means it's a lot easier to set up. Back when we had Darkrai, we did admittedly have Dark Patch, but still having this just as an energy and a DCE means that we can set this up in 2 turns so much more a lot more consistently, especially towards the late game. I mean that we only need 2 energy, we only need to hold on to a DCE to be able to set this up quite quickly. Just in general, being able to turn 2 Night Spear was always something that these Turbo Darkrai decks strive to be able to do, and being able to do that more consistently with the DCE sort of functionality is really, really nice. Turn 2 Night Spear, or Shadow Bullet in this case, is so strong, it applies a lot of pressure. Usually sets up a knockout for your next turn to be able to 2-shot something, but also begins dealing a little bit of damage to the bench. And this damage is now becoming more and more relevant, especially as we are seeing these evolution decks with these lower formed HPs. This all sort of ties in with the other win condition of the deck, but this extra 30 snipe is really, really influential. Finally, his GX attack, Nightcry-GX for a dark and a colourless. You just discard 2 energy off your opponent's board. It's a little bit underwhelming, and that's why more often than not we are going to perhaps look to go a different route. But that being said, in some decks people only run maybe 4 DCE and 1 or 2 special charge, and if we can make sure we save enough resources to be able to manage this kind of energy. This can seal a game, because we can get rid of sort of 2 energy and slow them down so much so that they're unable to recover if they don't have special charges left, and things like that. It's very rare that this is going to be what wins you the game, because we're running hammers anyway, so a combination of hammers and this, or the other win condition, it's never going to be this GX attack alone, but there can be win conditions created from this GX attack, so it's definitely one to always keep in the back of your mind, especially if you perhaps don't think you're going to be going down the Espeon win condition route. There is always the chance that you may be able to out-resource your opponent. Like I'm saying, it's not the greatest GX attack, but that's why we're pairing it with 2 Espeon-GX, just because we then have the versatility of being able to use another GX attack if we wish. So Espeon-GX, again, 200 HP stage 1 Psychic type, really, really strong. Weak to Psychic, 1 retreat cost, no resistance. 3 attacks again, we've got, for 1 Psychic, Psybeam does 30 damage and confuses the opponent. Can be a little bit annoying, sometimes they'll take an extra 30 on their turn and won't be able to attack, but sometimes they'll just be able to get through it, so it's not like that's what the deck revolves around, but we do have the option of maybe causing our opponent to think twice about attacking, or whether they want to take this extra 30 damage. Next up we have Psychic for a Psychic energy and a DCE. Does 60 damage plus 30 damage for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So again, with big things like your Veltol, who set up a lot of energy and just trying to swing through your deck, you can actually punish them for doing so. You can set up a Psychic, and whilst they're going to be able to do a lot of damage to you, if you can set it up so that you hit them before they hit you, more often than not you can deal a significant amount of damage, sometimes one-shotting them before they even get to try and take a knockout on this Espeon. So your opponent still has to always think about how much damage are they playing into with a Psychic, and how much damage can they afford to, or how much energy can they afford to attach to be able to then start dealing with your board, because we can always keep Espeon in the back of our minds, able to do this huge Psychic attack if our opponent sets up something that just tries to run through our whole deck. Finally, his GX attack is Division-GX for a Psychic and a DCE. Simply, you place 10 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way you like. Again, this seems relatively underwhelming initially, especially as it's only 10. Whilst 10 is a lot, with things now getting sort of 200 HP, it's not always as influential as it may seem. However, this is why we're also running an Espeon, and to an extent the Wobbufetts as well. But being able to place 10 sort of freely is a really, really strong effect, and it means that we can really set up some awkward knockouts, especially with this prior damage from Shadow Bullet that we've been putting about on our opponent's board. Just these extra 30 drops means that actually we can take 6 prizes in a turn with Division if the numbers work out right. That's not always going to happen, but that's why we're also running one Espeon-EX. His Miraculous Shine attack devolves each of our opponent's Pokemon. So this is the other win condition of the deck. As you can see, we're going from a 60 HP basic to a 200 HP stage 1. So all we need to do is all our opponent would need to do, for example, is put 60 damage on an Espeon or an Umbreon, and then next turn use Miraculous Shine. We have to pick up our Espeon, and all of a sudden our Eevee has 60 damage on it, meaning it's knocked out. So that's why this one-off Espeon is really nice. It means that we can set up a lot of different knockouts all in one turn, and it's another card that we can just throw up and be able to take a lot of prizes all in one turn for 1 energy. Requires no real sort of setup, it does require setup, but it requires no setup of himself. We don't need to attach 2 energy, or he's not sitting on the bench as a Lysandre target with an energy on or whatever for our opponent to knock out before we can get the combo off. All we need to do is find him and attach an energy, and we can be able to devolve our opponent's Pokemon. Obviously, because of the energy cost, we are also able to use Psyshock, which does 70 for a Psychic, and a DCE, which does 70 damage, and the effect of this attack's damage isn't affected by any effect on the opponent's Pokemon. So it gets through things like Safeguard and Regice, but more often than not, we're just going to be using it for this Miraculous Shine to have one big turn of being able to take out a couple of our opponent's big attackers if they're GX Pokemon, or if we're not getting knockouts. A lot of these GX decks will be running Rare Candy if they're stage 2. So if we're in a pinch, we can also use this as kind of a stall tactic, because if they've maybe got 3 GXs set up, but they've all been rare candied, it means that they can't drop them back down. They've then got 3 basics, but they have these 3 GXs in their hand, but without rare candies, they're not able to put these guys back down. So Espeon sets up some really, really interesting situations, and as a side note, it's nice that it's also an evolution that kind of fits in with the whole evolutions theme. Next up, we've got 2 Wobbufett. In some senses, this may seem like anti-synergy, but because of some cards we're running later, we can sort of make sure this isn't too anti-synergetic. But yeah, we are running Wobbufett with his Bide Barricade ability, meaning that no abilities other than Psychic types are online when this guy is in our active position. So if we're starting this, obviously we can't use our own Shaymins, but we can also block our opponents from using Shaymins, and things like Lurantis Plume often go sort of really aggro to try and find this Plume turn 1. So for the first point, this shuts off Plume because it's not a Psychic type, but secondly, it shuts off their Shaymin's turn 1, which means that they can't do this real aggro turn to try and get this Plume set up turn 1. If we simply start this guy, then they can't use their Shaymins to find the Plume, and even if they do find the Plume, it's not online while this guy is active, so we can just keep this guy active, still use all of our items, and then just retreat into one of our attackers when we're ready and when we just want to attack. Obviously, this is a really, really good strafe target, because when we're switching our active Umbreon into a bench Pokemon, we can just throw up a Wobbufett on our opponent's turn, stop them from using their abilities whilst not hindering us from using ours. We're running Float Stones to be able to get out of this guy as soon as it comes back to our turn, so if we've got one active, we can just Float Stone straight into our Umbreon, and it's like we've never really had a Wobbufett in the active. It's only really affected our opponent. Of course, this does affect our own Shaymins, so it's a bit unfortunate sometimes we will start with this. It also affects our Eevee being able to use its Energy Evolution ability to evolve into Umbreon and Espeon-GX, but we do have other ways of searching out these GX Pokemon, so it's not like this whole deck runs on Eevee attaching an energy and evolving that way. It's just a nice way of being able to do so. But yeah, we can really sort of abuse this Bide Barricade ability with Float Stones and things like that. It's not ideal some of the time, because we are, of course, like I'm saying, running Shaymins, but if we don't start Wobbufett, or if we start Wobbufett with a Float Stone, we can still get our Shaymin abilities online, provided we can get this guy out of the active, which isn't always that difficult. Otherwise, Shaymin, as everyone knows, is just a really, really nice cycle card. Yeah, pretty simple. Moving on to the supporters, we're running 4 Sycamore, pretty standard. 2 N. We've gone for a 4-2 line rather than a 3-3 line. I think this deck tries to be kind of aggressive. We want to maximise the chance of being able to get this turn 2 Shadow Bullet. And because of that, we're more often than not, we're going to be wanting to find Sycamore turn 1 to be able to find our answers or our cards that get us into this Shadow Bullet turn 2. So because of that, N isn't always getting us enough cards, and more often than not, we're going to be wanting to try and find Sycamore turn 1 anyway. So I think a 4-2 split is fine. We're running 2 Lysandre. Obviously, we can also Lysandre sort of stall things up with Wobbufett, because if they have free retreat due to an ability or something like that, it's going to be really awkward for them. Things like Solgaleo also have an ability on a non-psychic type that causes sort of retreating style mechanics. We can also catch the things in their deck up and cause them to not be able to use their Ultra Road ability. So all of these kind of things work together, and it all kind of comes together in a nice package where you're often going for a very similar sort of setup each game, being able to deal a lot of damage in the early game with Strafe and Shadow Bullet, and then block your opponent at the same time. And then later on in the game, we can devolve our opponent's Pokemon and take prizes that way. Otherwise, just Lysandering up what we want to take knockouts on or what we want to deal damage on for later on in the game is just really, really strong. Obviously, like we're saying, this 90-30 is such a huge sort of powerhouse if we can get it set up turn 2. So having Lysandre in here means that we can also sort of take advantage of what prizes we want to take as well. We're running 1 Team Flare Grunt and 1 Team Skull Grunt. Team Skull Grunt is a new card from Sun and Moon. You look at your opponent's hand and discard 2 energy there. So this is obviously these are both energy denial cards playing more into the energy denial side of the deck, This is really good for these sort of quad DCE style decks where they just run 4 DCE and a lot of cycle. In these types of decks, sometimes your opponent won't play a lot of energy down at once. They'll hold some DCEs, so maybe they play one DCE down, we're able to Crushing Hammer it off, and they play another one, and it kind of goes like that. But sometimes we can catch them. If we've got a turn where we don't need to use one of these draw supporters, we can catch them with a couple of DC in their hand, and it just puts them back so many steps. They have to then use their special charge just to be able to attack again, and it just really sort of mills them out of resources. So there's two kind of win conditions with this deck. We can either go down the evolution route, or we can go down the sort of running our opponent out of resources route. To a similar effect, we've got one Flare Grunt as well. Just stopping our opponent attacking for a turn can be really useful as well. One Hex Maniac. Obviously, Hex is another really, really strong card that can help us not get locked out by Vileplume. Also helps with things like Volcanion that often try and one-shot through us. We can't really use the Division Devolution tactic on them, so we're going to be looking to find value from Shadow Bullet. And in that case, we have to be able to trade with them efficiently. So that's where Hex Maniac and things like that are going to be more useful. We've got one Skyla. Again, just a really, really good card in this format. Also helps with... We're also running a Professor's Letter, as you'll see later on, so it helps us find our Professor's Letter early on to be able to find our energy to evolve into the evolutions that we want to. With this Skyla, we can find a Psychic Energy and a Dark Energy and evolve 2 Eevee in a turn, so it's technically like searching for 2 evolutions and evolving them as well, and attaching energy at the same time. So Skyla can be really, really strong in the early turns, and then later on when you're just looking for those last little resources, maybe that last Crushing Hammer or Enhanced Hammer to slow your opponent down and prevent them from winning in the next couple of turns, it's obviously really good for those types of scenarios as well. As standard, 4 VS Seeker and 4 Ultra Ball. Like I've been saying, whilst Wobbufett does shut off energy evolution, we are able to use Ultra Balls the old-fashioned way and just search out for our Umbreon and Espeon-GX anyway. 3 Trainer's Mail. Cycling through the deck is always good. It's just really good to keep this deck consistent. We're running Crushing Hammers as well, as you can see, so we want to be able to find these as and when we need them and be able to disrupt our opponent as much as possible. So having sort of more cycle cards is always good for a deck with a hammer style build. We're running 4 Crushing Hammer and 1 Enhanced Hammer just because it's kind of the standard hammer split. There's not enough of an emphasis on an Enhanced Hammer being better than Crushing Hammer at the moment. I think as the format evolves, maybe we will get there with things like Solgaleo, perhaps applying or attaching a lot more special energy with his Soul Burst GX attack. Maybe we're going to see this come up to a 2 count. Well, I think Crushing Hammer is always going to be a 4 count just because it's such a strong card and it lets you get rid of these basic energy as well, which can be annoying. 1 Super Rod, to be able to get things, well, to be able to reuse our resources essentially, but the main thing is we only run 1 Espeon-EX, and sometimes that is the main win condition against some decks. So if we have to discard this card early through a Sycamore or an Ultra Ball, just to sort of get going, it means that we don't lose a win condition out. We can still search for this win condition later on. As I mentioned earlier on, Professor's Letter technically searches for 2 of these pieces, provided we don't have Wobbufett active, and in general just helps us set up later on in the game or early on in the game, searching for these 2 energy and evolving up our Pokemon is just a really, really nice combination with the energy evolution ability. 3 Float Stones, so we can always get a float on Wobbufett as and when we need one. We don't want to be sort of stuck with our own Wobbufett active, because it means that we 1 can't apply pressure and 2 can't use any of our abilities. So we're running 3 even though we're only running 2 Wobbufett, because we always want to find a Float Stone for this Wobbufett early on. We always want to find a Float Stone for the Wobbufett early on to make sure it's not a liability on our side as well, because we want to be able to abuse the Buy Barricade ability, but we don't want it to hurt us too much either. So having a lot of Float Stones also means that we can't be Lysandre stalled with any of our other Pokemon as well. Stadium wise, we bring 1 Reverse Valley and 1 Parallel City. Reverse Valley obviously ups our damage, means that we can be doing more damage with Shadow Bullet. 100 damage is going to be two-shotting a couple more things. It means that we can hit 190 and 200 HP Pokemon for 2 hits, and we can set up things a little bit nicer with these extra 30 snipes. But in general, it's not going to be so influential, and that's why we're only playing one, because we've also got one Parallel City. Parallel City is really good sort of in both applications. In the Grass, Fire, Water application, there's a lot more Grass, Fire, Water decks coming out that seem to be really, really strong in this meta. Things like Lurantis Plume, Volcanion, Aqua Box, all of these decks are going to be top tier decks. So just minusing 20 damage outright means that we're going to be able to increase our survivability and win more prize trades. And then if we're lowering our opponent's bench to 3, it means that if we manage to get this Wobbufett active as well after strafes or just in between knockouts, our opponent's going to struggle to do even more because they've got a limited bench size, they can't use their abilities, so they can't just bench cards and sort of end themselves so they don't draw them later on, things like that. So both of the sides of Parallel are really, really strong for a deck that runs kind of a locking style as well. This deck has a lot of versatility. We've got sort of the damage and devolution side of it, and then we've also got the running out of resources and locking style of it as well, so it's going to be a difficult deck to play around. Finally, energy-wise, 4 DCE because a lot of our attacks are DC compatible, so it's really, really useful to be able to have the maximum count. 5 Dark and 2 Psychic. The emphasis is definitely on Umbreon. We want to be using Shadow Bullet turn 2 as consistently as possible. Oh, you can't see those 2. There are 2 Psychic. We want to be using Shadow Bullet turn 2 as consistently as possible, and because of that we are running a lot more Dark than Psychic, but having these Psychic in here, especially with a letter, means that we can search out for Espeon when we need to be able to get this Division-GX attack off, and then we also can use the attacks of Wobbufett and Espeon-EX as well if we need to. It's going to be very rare that we set up situations like that, but if we division into a specific number of damage, we can then use Wobbufett's attack later on to do a sort of that amount of damage plus 20, which means that we can set up other knockouts for, rather than one of these two prize Pokemon, we can use Wobbufett as an attacker as well. So having these Psychics means that we do have the versatility of being able to use Division but other attacks as well. Like, we wouldn't get away with just one. Also, if we only have one, if it's prized, then we can never use Division-GX, which can mean that we have a whole win condition locked out from us. So yeah, it's a really, really different deck. It's quite a versatile deck, and it's quite a difficult one to play around, because there's lots of approaches that we have winning a game. And it's definitely one of my favourite decks. The more I'm sort of thinking about this deck and looking at this deck and doing sort of test stands with it, the more I'm really, really liking the different avenues it can go down. And even in a best of 3 scenario, you can win in very different games. So it's definitely going to be a difficult deck to play around, and I think it has some real viability against some of the new top tier decks. It's got a lot of versatility, a lot of power, a lot of raw power in Shadow Bullet. So yeah, it's definitely one to watch out for and one to try. And also check out, I don't know whether it will be out before or after this video, but we will have another Umbreon deck analysis for you guys, so make sure you check out that one as well, if you want a different way of playing Umbreon, more focused on just pure raw damage. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack from Omnipoke, and I look forward to seeing you guys in another video.